Hello guys, how are you all? Welcome to my channel. So, today we are gonna see, what if Naruto was in Hunter x Hunter, and got harem, movie 2. Subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and also make sure to check out the author of this fanfic, Aizen the Goat, and support him for writing this awesome fanfic. Link is in the description. Let's start the story. Naruto never thought he'd see the day when humans would be capable of flight. Even back home the only one he knew of was that Tsuchikage somehow had the ability, and later himself after meeting the sage. So for regular people to become so advanced as to create machines capable of traveling through the air at pretty fast speeds, well, he was impressed to say the least. Rather than using his ability of flight, as they had been doing, Mei had insisted on using a form of transportation that the people here used. With the amount of money they'd made while working their way up the floors of the arena, they had more than enough to buy 2 tickets onto an airship heading towards York New Online. It's amazing, isn't it? Mei asked while leaning over in her seat to stare out the window. Below them, the city seemed small, and occasionally obscured by the few clouds that inhabited the sky. While they'd flown together with his 6 paths powers, the ship was coasting at a greater height than he usually flew. It is, he replied. Wait until everyone back home hears about this. Speaking of which, he unsealed a few sheets of paper, and pulled out a small food tray from the seat in front of him, and began writing something down. Mei glanced at the paper. Writing your report to the Hokage? She asked rhetorically. Anytime he wrote anything it was always to the same person. Are you gonna tell him the news? She asked, referring to her pregnancy. Naruto shook his head. Not yet. I want to wait a little bit. Mei shook her head in slight amusement and reclined back in her seat. I'm going to rest for a little while. Wake me up when we get there, she ordered. Naruto muttered an affirmative response and continued writing, detailing his latest month of adventures, as well as letting him know where they'd be going next. It would probably sound like pure gibberish to the man, which was why he also had a spare map of the world and a postcard that he was going to send along with his letter. The map would give him an idea of distance, while the postcard would give him a small look into where he'd been. Soon the blonde finished his letter and sealed it away, deciding to send it via one of his toads once they landed. Glancing out of the window once more he saw that the sun had finally set and night was upon them. He stretched and yawned, as he did so before reclining back as well and closing his eyes to rest. It was unlikely that anyone would try and rob them, as most of the people in this ship had less than average levels of aura, and even if they were a potential threat, they'd be dealt with before they knew what happened. He closed his eyes and let sleep take him for the night. Naruto woke up a few hours later to find that the sun had risen, and they were about an hour away from their destination. At least that's what the small tablet in front of them said. By the time they arrived, the two were offered a ride to wherever they needed to go, but chose against it. The two were tired from sitting that long, and decided to begin walking towards where the Southern Peace auction would be taking place. It would be a few hours by foot, but they'd done that before going back home, going from village to village, so it wasn't an issue. Plus, they had the added benefit of seeing the new architecture and beauty of the city. It was much larger than where Heaven's Arena was, as it seemed to be a more business-oriented city, as the amount of corporate buildings was overwhelming. Not to say that's all it was. No, as they approached the Southerpeace auction house they noticed the number of very lavish-looking hotels increase. The homes they saw depicted on billboards and advertisements on TV from stores also told them this was mostly for the rich and powerful, which made sense if an auction this large was taking place here. That wasn't all they learned of this place either. One very important detail was revealed to them, as they stopped by a restaurant earlier in the day to get some food. The city was infested with what they called the Mafia, which was just different organized crime families fighting for power and control. It seemed no matter where you were in the world there were people trying to start conflict for petty reasons. So what should we do first today? Mei asked, holding onto his arm, as they made their way into a large hotel a few streets away from the auction house. Well, we did eat a few hours ago. I think we can stop somewhere for a bite, and then make a plan from there, he responded. They approached a young woman standing behind a counter, and asked about availability. They had a few rooms towards the top floors, but, as they had the best view of the city, and more space than others, it would be pricier. They were charging a few thousand jenny per night. To a normal person that would have been excessive, but they had money to spare, and took the room. Their room in Heaven's Arena was lavish, but this was on another level. Everything in the room was larger, from the bed to the tub in the bathroom. At least they knew they were getting their money's worth. After unsealing some clothing, and hanging it up on the hangers provided, they made their way back down, and headed to a small restaurant across the street for some lunch. It's nice here, Mei commented, looking around. They sat at a table that had a decent view of the entrance, as well as the counter where one would place their order. Taking a sip of her water, Mei asked once more. So what do you want to do? Do we stick to the same plan of exploring until the auction starts? Because we still have about a month and a half. Naruto shook his head. We wouldn't be exploring that long. Sure, we'll take in the sights, but we'll take our time. I think we should work on our nen. You seem oddly eager to practice. You developed your hatsu while I was asleep or something? She asked in a playful tone. Mei knew he was curious as to what her idea for hers was, and knew she was in the finishing stages of giving it form, so she wouldn't put it past him to want to catch up. To her surprise, he shook his head. Not exactly, but I have the feeling I'll be creating it soon. Do you have a feeling? She asked curiously. Ever since you told me you were pregnant, I've had this thing in the back of my mind telling me to work on my Nen. I'll develop it soon. Had they still been back in the elemental nations, she would have found some humor in him basing his decisions on a small feeling, but that feeling led them here, so maybe he was onto something. The conversation was cut short when one of the workers yelled out Naruto's name, causing him to stand up and retrieve their food. They ate while occasionally feeding each other some of their dishes to see if one another liked it, while also conversing about the past few days, and what the rest of their time until the auction would look like. As they ate, Naruto noticed the door to the restaurant open, and in walked someone with above average levels of aura. She was a woman perhaps the same age as Mei, and wore a purplish suit consisting of a rather short skirt that ended quite a few inches above her knees, showing off a great pair of legs if he was honest. Her top was buttoned just under her breasts, showing off a large amount of cleavage that Naruto tried not to stare at. She had short blonde hair that was parted in the center, giving her two very small strands in front of her face, as well as an aquiline nose. To finish off her ensemble, she wore a matching colored pair of flats on her feet. She walked up to the counter and muttered something to the worker who pulled out a bag from somewhere behind them and handed it to her. Naruto's eyes stayed on her as she made her way back towards the front door and didn't look away when the woman turned and locked eyes with him. He wasn't sure if he had imagined it, but he was sure she smirked at him just before making her way out the door. Unknown to them, even though they had their aura reined in using Zetsu, any decent hunter and end user in general could feel the power they held, and the woman was no exception. Someone caught your eye, I see. Mei said, also having a smirk on her face, as she watched the woman walk away through the large window at the front. Think about what I told you before, soon our fun is going to have to stop altogether. She added. She was a good-looking woman, that's all. He responded, to which Mei simply nodded. Though her face had a look that screamed she wasn't buying it. Most guys would kill to be in your position, you know. She commented after taking a bite of her food. He knew right. Most guys back home could only dream of what it would be like to sleep with Mei, and here he was doing just that, and she was all but telling him to get a second woman, because she couldn't keep up with him. I know just how lucky I am. I'll keep an eye out, alright. He replied. Mei nodded. Just remember what I told you, I'm your number one, and always will be. You wouldn't have to tell me that. He finished for her. The pair finished their meals with the topic of a second woman not coming up anymore. Once finished, they headed over to the auction house to see what the process of submitting an item consisted of. They were told that they had a week from today to propose an item to be put up for auction. Naruto was ready to let them know what he had, but was stopped by the auburn-haired woman, who simply thanked the man for the information and let them back out. So why didn't we submit? Naruto asked, as they walked down the busy streets. You're letting your excitement get the best of you. We have an ingredient that's native to the Dark Continent. She said, saying the last part in a hushed tone, so no one could overhear their conversation. Once they know that, they'll begin to ask questions, and that will draw unwanted attention towards us. Except for a few, most people don't even know that it exists. That was true. So we need a way to do this anonymously. He replied, trying to think of a way to get that done. After a moment or so of nothing coming to mind, he shrugged. We'll worry about it later, we have time anyway. For now, let's find somewhere to train for a while. He stopped shortly after speaking, and stared down at her with a critical look. Wait, can you train? He asked out loud, more to himself than to her. Mei was about to tell him that pregnant Kunoichi could train well in their early stages of pregnancy so long as it wasn't anything too strenuous, but didn't get a chance to let him know. She was sure men had to be similar, but since it was the manipulation of her life force, there would be some minor changes. Before she could utter a word, Naruto had his phone out and up to his ear. Who are you calling? She asked, but was ignored as he brought a hand up to her face which irked her to no end. Hey Silva, yeah, everything is good on my end. Naruto spoke into the phone. Mei blinked, realizing he was talking to the head of the Zoldyck family. I met one of your other kids, by the way. Yeah, Kilia. He's a good kid, a little shy though. Anyway, I wanted to ask, is Nen training okay for a pregnant woman? Naruto asked. He was silent for a few moments, nodding every now and then at whatever Silva told him. At one point he unsealed a small notepad and began scribbling whatever was being told to him. The woman palmed her face at her younger man's actions, but also did so to hide the smile that broke out on her face. Despite only just telling him about expecting, he's already taking it into account. Alright. Got it. Thank you, bye. Hanging up the phone, he stuffed it back into his pocket and turned back to Mei. He says it's fine if you're still in the early stages, but once you start to show, and later on to slow down, and only work on the basics in a non-combat oriented way. He explained. Mei shook her head, not bothering to tell him that that's what she was going to explain, and instead sighed. Good to know. can we get going now? After a few hours of walking, the pair came across a large empty section of land a few miles out of the city that was perfect for their training. There was nothing they could accidentally destroy, but it was still a close enough distance to the city that they could be back in no time. It only took so long to arrive because they didn't know where they were going the first time. For the next few hours, Mei focused on maintaining her ren for a longer period of time. While she was able to hold it for a decent period of time, she felt like she could improve upon it, and considering the Hatsu she had in mind, she would need a large pool to draw from. Naruto meanwhile created a few hundred clones around him, and proceeded to remove his shirt. Folding it until it was in the shape of a large rectangle, he proceeded to tie it around his head to cover his eyes. Once it was nice and secure, he focused his aura, and activated both Ten and Ren at the same time. While his range easily covered 5 miles due to his insane amount of aura, he noticed it had an almost erratic shape. Perhaps shape was the wrong word, his aura would simply explode outwards with a shape resembling a wildfire, completely uncontrolled. It almost looked like the ends of his chakra cloak when he was using 6 paths mode. Not needing that much area covered, he adjusted the amount of aura he was releasing, and used Hen to mold it into a dome shape. It was slightly difficult at first. It reminded him of when he was younger, and was trying to give shape to his Rasengan, only this time things went a lot smoother. It only took him a minute or so to shape his aura how he wanted, and soon he was ready. Apart from his clones, and Mei, the blonde sensed someone off in the distance staring in their direction. He seemed to have his hands in his pockets, and was seemingly content to stay where he was. He hadn't been too sure, but, as they had made their way over to the spot, he could have sworn someone was following them. Now he knew for sure. Making a mental note to check out if he was still there when he was finished, he gave his clones a thumbs up, signaling them to begin. One by one the clones charged at him, each branding a kunai trying to get a hit on him. Even with his eyes closed, using An made it to where he could still see them. Their shape, movements, and even build-up of chakra, as they created a Rasengan, was all clearly visible to him. The one thing that did stand out to him in between ducking, dodging, and countering the clones' attacks, however, was that they were incapable of using Nen. Despite being clones of me, they're still just chakra constructs. He thought to himself, as he parried one of his clones' attacks, and kicked it hard enough to force it to dispel. Tilting his head to the side, he let a kunai slice the air next to him. Before his clone had a chance to pull its hand back and try again, the original used Ren on his right arm, and delivered a palm thrust to the chest. The force produced by the attack instantly destroyed the clone, and produced a small shock wave that destroyed a few behind it, as well. The clones were only slightly surprised by the attack, but quickly regained their composure. Soon, the kunais were abandoned, and he could see the hand signs being performed. Jutsu after jutsu were fired, techniques ranging from fire to water, electricity to earth. The clones even coordinated with each other, doing their best to create openings for another, and even sending in others to get close, and try, and engage in hand-to-hand, while they shot off elemental techniques. Damn. Is this what people feel when fighting me? He thought to himself, slightly annoyed that the jutsu just kept coming. He could have easily won by activating his 6 paths or firing back, but he wanted to do this completely with Nen. The sparring went on for another hour or so before he called them off, and forced them to dispel in small amounts, so he wouldn't get a headache. Removing the makeshift blindfold from his eyes, he used it to wipe the sweat off his brow. Are you done? He heard Mei ask him, as she stood next to him, and offered him some water she'd unsealed. The blonde looked over at her, and found he couldn't answer. His eyes trailed down from her face, which was covered with a thin coat of sweat, down towards her stomach. She wasn't showing even remotely, but it now had his full attention. He still couldn't believe he was going to have a family. One of the things he'd yearned for the most, as a child. Despite only just having found out about it, he found himself thinking of the future of his child more and more. Naruto wouldn't have his child go through even a fraction of what he endured growing up. Mei frowned and asked the question again, but it fell on deaf ears, as he was too lost in his own world to comprehend what she'd said. His mind was littered with thoughts about his lack of a family, and what his future with Mei and their child would look like. Hell, it was only in recent years that he'd met his mom, and spent some time with his undead dad. He knew that he was a member of the Uzumaki clan, and they were most known for their mastery over, but that's all. He never got the opportunity to learn their legacy, and didn't even inherit their famous red hair. The blonde had seen firsthand what seals were capable of from Jiraiya early in his life, then realized just how strong they actually were in the form of the second and the fourth Hokage's iteration. Seals could warp space, create barriers, reflect, and he'd learned none of it. Apart from his dad's Rasengan, he'd have nothing of his mother's side of the family that he'd be able to pass down. Naruto hadn't noticed, but, as his thoughts veered to his mom's side of the family, and his unborn child, his aura began to change. Mei, having begun to snap her fingers in front of him to get the glossed-over look in his eyes to go away, stopped when she noticed his aura change color. The usual white that surrounded their bodies when they used their nen took on a dark red color. Naruto's right index finger pointed slightly above them, and quickly drew a large circle in midair. Mei watched on with wide eyes, as the 2 kanji characters for the word reflect appeared in the center of the circle. Boxing the kanji in the center were two squares, one regular one, and one tilted on its side. Finally, slightly inside the first circle was another circle, and in between the two were hundreds of different characters that spun around the entire thing. Almost as if snapping out of a trance, the blonde blinked, and he came back to his senses. His eyes immediately locked onto the large floating circle in the air, and took in every detail. "What is that?" Mei asked in a soft tone, as she got closer to inspect what he'd made. Naruto stared at the large seal he'd subconsciously created, and recalled the conversation they'd had with the Zoldycks when they were taught about Nen. "That's my Hatsu," he revealed. "A seal?" Mei asked. "Well, the Uzumaki were known for their mastery over them, but to my knowledge, none were able to simply make one in the air," she said. "You didn't even write out any of the individual characters that are on here?" She continued in amazement. Naruto nodded. Zeno and Silva said that one's Hatsu usually reflects the user. "I was thinking about my mom's side of the family, and how I wished I was able to learn something from them. Next thing I knew, I made this," he explained. The circular seal soon disappeared, and he was quick to create another. He wasn't sure how, but his hand moved again, this time with his middle finger extended, as he drew the circle. Similar to the first one, this seal he created was just as intricate. Naruto continued drawing seals in the air for the next minute, until he created 6 different seals. The first one was designed to reflect attacks directly, one of them reflected attacks, and changed the speed at which it would be sent back. Another changed the size of attacks, meaning it could be shot back larger or smaller than it originally was. One of his Nen seals paralyzed a target upon being touched, and the last one was broken up into 2 parts, acting as a portal of sorts. An attack would enter through one, and exit out of the other. Incredible. Mei complimented before she remembered something. "What about the drawbacks?" "The stronger one's Hatsu is, the larger the drawbacks have to be to balance it out," she reminded him. Naruto nodded. "I can only use 2 different seals at a time, but I can make up to 6 of each selected seal. The larger the seal, the more aura I use to create it, and keep it in place," he explained. "So it doesn't allow you to just fill up an area with seals, and forces you to choose specific ones for different battles," she surmised. "I assume you can change them mid-battle?" "Yup. As long as the number of seals out at a time is 2, it doesn't matter if I interchange them. Not only that, but the reflection seals don't have to fire back instantly. They can hold the attack in place until I release it, but the restriction on that is that they can only hold 1 attack at a time," he explained. "I call it Sage's Counter." "Sage's Counter, a fitting name," she commented before smiling at him. "Well, I think it's only fair since you showed me yours that I show you mine," she said with a teasing undertone. "We'll also be able to see how well your Hatsu works," she added afterwards. Mei's aura bursted out of her like a broken dam, just like his, and unsurprisingly, the white aura turned into a brilliant blue. The auburn-haired woman extended her left hand with her palm facing upward. A light blue orb floated above her open palm before stretching into the shape of a slightly curved staff. He watched her put her right hand above the other, and make a pulling motion which created a blue arrow. The bow, Naruto realized. "Can you put up the reflex seal, please?" she requested. Naruto did, as he was told, and created the circular seal in mid-air before stepping away. She aimed directly at the seal, and fired. The force of the attack being fired created a small rut in the ground that followed the trajectory of the arrow. Just as the arrow was about to collide with the seal, it changed direction, and went upwards towards the sky. Naruto frowned, wondering what was going on. Looking over at Mei, he saw she had a smirk on her face. Making eye contact with him, she made a few motions with her fingers that made the arrow turn around, and come back towards the ground. She can control it after it's been fired, he thought in amazement. Soon the arrow made its way back towards the seal, and impacted. The white seal matched the color of her aura, indicating it had sealed an attack, and continued spinning in its hypnotic fashion. Mei moved to stand next to him, and nodded at him. The seal began to slow down before stopping completely, and began turning in the opposite direction. A small boom noise was made, as the attack was shot back in the opposite direction. The two watched, as her aura arrow began to drop now that it wasn't being guided, and hit the ground. A split second after the impact, a large explosion occurred. The aura from the arrow exploded outwards in a dome-like shape until it died out. When the smoke cleared, Naruto couldn't help but let out a small whistle at the large crater that was left behind. "Well, what did you think?" she asked in a playful manner, noticing the look of awe on his face. "It's impressive. The fact that you can control it even more so." Mei nodded, looking pleased with herself. "I'm glad you like it. I call it aura ordnance. I can create different weapons out of my aura," she revealed before continuing. "With the bow and arrow, I keep a very thin strand of aura connected to the arrow, then use manipulation to control it." Naruto remembered the Nen chart that the Zoldycks had shown them when they were taught about it. The mission was in between manipulation and enhancement. It was clear Mei had made good use of them. "What about enhancement?" he asked. Mei created another orb which quickly began taking the form of a large aura sword that had an X shape just above the handle. The look of it soon changed until it had a more solid look. It was still clear that it was her aura, but now the flow was smooth to the point that it looked solid. Using enhancement I can make the blade sturdy, and if needed I can also use it to shoot my aura after a swing. Since it's such a simple technique, the only drawback is that I need enough aura to maintain them. She explained before releasing the technique. Naruto couldn't help but feel that it fit her well, being from the nation that was famous for its swordsmen. He couldn't think of a more fitting weapon for her. Still, it seemed that she had more applications of it, and he couldn't wait to see what she had hidden. I knew it would be incredible. He complimented. We can tell each other more about our Hatsu later after we greet our guests. The woman frowned. Guess. There was no one around them. Yeah. Someone's been watching us. They're pretty far away, but I felt him when I used N before sparring with my clones. Now if I put a little emotion behind it, he trailed off, as he extended his N once more. This time, whoever was watching would know that his attention was on him. From inside his N, Naruto could sense that the man was making his way over. The two waited side by side for a few minutes until the man was close enough that they could make out his features. He was an older man, probably in his 30s, wearing light gray pants that were tucked into black boots, along with a matching long-sleeve shirt that was covered up slightly by a large dark gray cloth held together at the waist by a black sash, and a dark blue scarf around his neck. Is it me, or does he look familiar? Mei asked, as soon as he was within a few feet of them. No, I see it too. He responded quickly. Before the man could utter a single word, Naruto beat him to the punch, and asked, is your last name Freaks by any chance? The man blinked, surprise clear on his face. How do you know? We met someone a little while ago that looks just like you. His last name is Freaks, so I figured yours would be too. The man smirked, and let out a laugh. So you met Gonha. How was he? Mei was next to answer. He seemed well enough. He was at Heaven's Arena with one of his friends. A big bowl of sunshine really. Apart from his fight with Hisoka, every time we saw him he was smiling. The man seemed proud to hear the news of his son. He of course knew who Hisoka was, and if Gon was battling someone like him, it could only mean that he'd begun to learn to use Nen. I'm glad. Anyway, since I'm here I might as well introduce myself. Ging Freaks. Naruto Uzumaki. Meichirumi. A pleasure. Ging replied. Not to sound rude or anything, but why were you trailing us? Naruto asked outright. Ging seemingly expected that question, and answered quickly. Curiosity. He said, followed by one of the things the pair had begun to grow used to hearing. You have the most intense aura I've felt, and believe me, I've met some of the most powerful people. How would you know that? We were in Zetsu all the way up until we got here. Naruto revealed. Ging blinked a couple of times, not expecting that reply. Now sporting a look of confusion, he asked, you've been using Zetsu? I'm pretty sure any Nen user could still sense the two of you. Now it was the couple's turn to blink in surprise, and in an instant the same thought occurred to them. Their chakra. The Zoldycks were able to feel it before they opened their aura nodes. Looks like we'll have to work on it some more. Naruto commented, not wanting to say that it was their chakra. Mind if I ask you a question though? Ging nodded. Are you a hunter? I am. I'm an archaeological hunter. Ging elaborated. Naruto's eyes lit up at the revelation. So you're like an explorer. In that regard they were similar, as that was the entire reason that Naruto was out here in the first place. A need to go out looking for something. Gon's dad chuckled at his expression, but nodded nonetheless. Something like that. One of the rules of being a hunter is that you must always be hunting something, and my dream is to explore a certain place, so becoming a hunter was the clear move to make. I don't have the clearance for that yet, but I'm not too worried about it. I'm not in a hurry. That bit of information piqued both Dark Continent inhabitants. Where would that be? Mei asked, having noticed how he deliberately failed to give the name of the location. Ging shook his head. Sorry, but I can't talk about that just yet. Confidential information. That was all the couple needed to hear to confirm their suspicions. Ging wanted to explore the Dark Continent. Rather than try and press the issue, they let it drop and ended up chatting with the man for a while. Naruto was curious about the things the man had seen in his adventures, while Mei was interested in his abilities as a hunter. A quick use of Gyro told them he was using Ten, keeping his aura close to his body. While he may have looked laid back, he was prepared for battle. They could tell he was powerful by the feeling of his aura and the way he carried himself. Ging humored Naruto and told him of some of the most outlandish places he visited and the things he'd found which only made Naruto want to see them for himself. He did mention how they should take the hunter exam, as it would make exploration easier for them if that was their goal. The older freaks didn't know what it was about the blonde, but he found they got along really well. If they became archaeological hunters like himself, then maybe in the future they could help him with his plans. Ging. You said the hunter's license lets you go to places normally off limits, right? Naruto asked. The man nodded. Mostly. Yeah. What about the Kakin Kingdom? Mei asked, since that was their destination after Yorknu. The man rubbed his chin and nodded slowly. It's a little tricky with them since they kind of do their own thing. As such, only hunters, high government officials, and authorized personnel are allowed in. Naruto made a mental note to look into the hunter exam and see when it would be taking place. Ging patted himself down quickly and stretched for a moment before speaking again. Well, Thank you too for the conversation, but I need to be off. Hopefully we bump into each other again. I can tell there's something different about you too, and I'm curious to know what that is. He said before walking off in the direction he came. Why don't we head out as well? Mei suggested. I think we could both use a nice bath to celebrate creating our Hatsu. Naruto needed little convincing, and took her by the hand before leading them back. Meanwhile Ging continued walking until he was far enough away to pull out his phone and make a call. Inputting the numbers he hovered over the call button for a moment before dialing one Isaac Netero. He needed some information. At their hotel later that night Naruto and Mei laid cuddling in bed, both content with the silence present until the woman broke it. It looks like the idea for Kakin might fall through. She commented quietly. Naruto shook his head. Only for now. After the auction we'll look into getting the licenses. Speaking of the auction, what's our plan for that? We can't go ourselves. She asked. Naruto hummed for a moment, then, a thought hit him. The Zoldycks. They turned over slightly to look at him. What about them? They're really well connected, right? Maybe they have someone who could go on our behalf to sell it as if it was theirs. Then we could just attend and check out the items while the attention isn't on us. I suppose that could work. They wouldn't do it for free though. She shot back. I'm sure we can come to an arrangement. With their plan set, the two let their bodies relax until the embrace of sleep took over them. The two slept soundly through the night, unaware of the series of events that would be unfolding over the next month. The sound of water droplets colliding with the ground resonated through the walls of a large building that once served as a warehouse. One wouldn't think buildings like this would be found in a place like Yorknew, but like every city in the world, there were the less savory parts. The inside of the building was mostly barren, except for a few large pieces of debris and concrete that had been broken down and used as makeshift chairs. Sitting atop these pieces of concrete were three people, the first being a woman in a light purple business suit that she wore with the top partially opened, revealing a good amount of cleavage, and the skirt that showed a large amount of her creamy skin. She was member number 9 of the infamous band of thieves known as the Phantom Troupe, Pakinoda. Sitting on a slab of concrete next to her was a relatively small man wearing a light blue tunic that covered most of his body, only allowing the bottom part of lighter blue pants to be shown along with his black shoes. Most of his face was obscured by his hair which he kept down, and across most of his face. The only thing that could be seen of his face was his large left eye that peered out from the darkness. This was member number 12 of the Phantom Troupe, Kortopi. The two individuals were staring in the direction of the final person in the room. Sitting across from them, leaning forward, was a rather young-looking man with black hair that he kept slicked back, and green earrings that hung down below his earlobes. He wore a black jacket with a golden upside-down cross on the back that he kept open in the front to have his chest on display. In his hand was a black book that he seemed to be enjoying if the smile on his face was any indication. He was the leader of the Phantom Troupe, Crawler Lucifer. Pakinoda's face showed no emotion as she waited for the man to speak, though if one looked very close, they would see the subtle signs of frustration building up beneath the surface. Having been a part of the group for so long, extended periods of silence from their leader were a common occurrence. However, just because it was common didn't mean she would ever get used to it. Finally, after a prolonged period of silence, Crawler finally spoke. It's unlike you to be worried about anyone outside of the group, he said in a soft tone. Even though he was soft-spoken, the words were still carried through the whole building. His words rang true. Though, the same could be said about every member of their group. Hailing from Meteor City, none of them officially existed in the world. Since most of them didn't exist, as far as the world was concerned, most people that came out of the city were hitmen and assassins that were usually recruited by the mafia. No one ever cared for them, so in turn, they cared very little for anyone else. That's the way it had been for years. Still, while she was sure most of the members didn't care whether they were cared for by others or not, she was different. Pakinoda didn't want to go through the rest of her miserable life as someone who didn't exist. Deep down, a part of her wanted to be more than just a useful member of a band of thieves. These were thoughts she'd never say out loud, and mostly kept to herself. That wasn't to say she didn't care for the people she called comrades though. Their leader took her and the others in all those years ago, and gave them a purpose. Something that at the time sounded great, it sounded like something to live for, and she was okay with it, as long as they made it out of Meteor City. That was the reason she went along with every plan, every heist, and every assassination to the best of her abilities, even after she realized it wasn't what she wanted anymore. Which was why when she felt the presence of two people with power like she'd never experienced, she felt the need to report it immediately. I do when they're this strong, she replied back in an equally calm tone. Crawler looked at her for a moment before his gaze shifted to Kortopi, who stared back lazily with his one visible eye. Kortopi shrugged and turned to look at the sole woman in the room. We've encountered powerful Nen users before. Silva Zoldyck being one of the most prominent, but we made it through. What makes these two people any different? He asked in a tone still as calm and unbothered as ever. His face didn't change in the slightest, seemingly unconcerned with the news. It was expected, though, having encountered people like the Zoldycks, there weren't too many that posed a large threat. There was a hunter association, but they didn't act as a police force, so they weren't that big of a concern. What I sensed from them was far beyond anything we've come across. She replied in her usual tone, not giving any indication that she was concerned by the leader's lack of concern. Krallo hummed silently to himself after hearing her reply. Do you believe they might pose a threat to us? We haven't done anything that might have upset them. They would have been looking for us if we had. Pakinota nodded. There's only one reason NAN users gather in Yorknew around this time. Kortopi nodded to himself, knowing exactly where the woman was going with this. Likewise, their leader knew, as well. The Southerpes auction, he stated. Either the guards for a mafia family or are auctioning something off. Having the entirety of the troop gather here on the 31st tells me that we're doing something relating to the auction, she stated. Krallo smiled and nodded at her assessment. That's correct. I was going to wait until the troop had gathered in its entirety to announce it, but yes. We're going to steal everything that's up for auction. All the more reason to be concerned, the woman reiterated. Not even Chairman Netero felt as dangerous as those two, she said, remembering the feeling she had when she was near them. We can't move hastily with unknowns like them, she concluded. Their leader closed his eyes and rested his head on an open palm for a moment. The silence continued once more, the only sound anyone could hear being the soft crackling of the flame from the candles that were lit around the area. For the next few minutes, the three thieves were silent until Krallo spoke once more. I'll trust your judgment, he said. If they're present for the auction, it could cause problems for us. Perhaps, it would be best if they were with us instead of potentially against us. His words caught both troop members by surprise, and their faces reflected their shock. It took a lot to break the stoic look the woman had worn for the past few years, but this was one that managed to do it. There were only 13 of them at a time. The thought that he would be willing to introduce 2 more was certainly surprising. You're surprised, he said, stating the obvious. It's not something I would normally consider, but anyone potentially stronger than the man regarded as the strongest NAN user is better alongside you than against you, he explained. His words made sense to them. However, there was still the matter of how to get them to join. You'll attempt to recruit them then? She asked. Krallo shook his head. No. You will, he replied. I need Kortopi for something before the rest arrive, and Shalnark will be arriving tomorrow. I would partner him up with you, but like Kortopi, I need his ability. You have until the day of the auction to sway them to her side. Pakinota showed no outward reaction to the order, but mentally went over how she would go about doing this. She hadn't officially met them. The only thing that had happened was locking eyes with the young man as she exited. Her eyes locked onto the flame on the wick of the candle. She couldn't force them. She knew that much. Her mind thought back to the brief moment when she noticed his eyes trail up and down her body before looking away. Perhaps she would need to play it from another angle. Is that all? She asked politely. Krallo nodded and reopened his book. Do your best, he told her before getting back to his reading. Taking one last look at Kortopi, she nodded and began making her way out of the building. As she walked out into the sun and made her way back into the center of Yorknew, she mentally went over her plan. She would need to get close to the pair and earn their trust before presenting them with what she hoped they'd see as an opportunity. Come on, pick up, Naruto muttered to himself from his spot on the bed as he waited for the patriarch of the Zoldyck family to pick up the phone. Naruto. The voice of Silva rang out. Silva, did I catch you at a bad time? He asked, hoping he hadn't. We've just returned from one actually. What can I do for you? I assume this isn't a social call, Silva responded. Naruto nodded, even though he knew the man couldn't see it. He glanced in the direction of the bathroom where he heard the sound of the knobs being turned and the water stopping for a moment before resuming his call. He went on to explain their predicament about how they wanted to attend the auction by putting a certain item up for sale. I see, Silva replied. Realistically, it would be easier to buy the catalog from the auction. It acts as your entry ticket as well. That was something they'd learned recently, and while convenient also had a drawback. I'm aware, but the catalogs cost 12 million Jenny apiece. Money is no issue at the moment, but the prices for nice hotels seem to increase with every city, Naruto replied. I don't feel like having to go to Heaven's Arena all the time. Besides, we're only putting up a little bit, less than half of a pound. The man hummed on the line, and Zeno's voice could be heard muttering alongside him. We can definitely help you. This time it was the elder Zoldyck who had spoken. However, it will come at a cost. Nothing they hadn't anticipated, he thought. Everything the Zoldyck did was in pursuit of making a profit, and this would be no different. I expected as much. Seeing as you knew what it was, I'm inclined to believe there's others out there who also know what it is. You know it'll go for a hefty price. How about 30% of whatever it sells for? He offered. While 30% would definitely be a lot of money lost, the amount they'd gain was still worth making the deal, so he wasn't stressing about it. Even after bartering a bit with the family of assassins and auctioning a small bit off, they still had pounds of the stuff available, and would have plenty of money once it sold. Besides, he was certain that, as it stood, he was the only one who could freely go to the Dark Continent and obtain more if needed. All he really wanted was to see what kind of strange items the world went crazy for, and maybe even buy one, as a souvenir to take home when the time came. Zeno made a sound typical of old men when they're thinking something over for a moment. In his mind he could see the old man tugging at his mustache, as he thought it over. We've done jobs like this in the past for no less than 40, but because of what it is we're dealing with, 30 will still guarantee a sizable amount. We have a deal. Excellent. How should we do this? He heard a bit of noise on the other side of the line, and when he finally got an answer, it was Silva once again. We'll get in contact with the organizers of the auction, and let them know we have a special item we'd like to sell off. Once we hear back from them, we'll have to meet in person to get the merchandise. Naruto figured he refused to say ice out of caution. He wasn't sure how likely it would be for someone to listen in on their conversation, but if they were being cautious, he'd follow suit. Perfect. I do have one more thing to ask though. The line went silent, which he assumed meant the man was listening. What if they ask questions? The public doesn't seem aware of the place's existence from what we've gathered. Our family has a reputation, and many connections. They'll know better than to ask questions. Silva explained. As for the general public, they have heard about it. About 300 years ago a book was written and published detailing it, but it's been officially listed as a fictional work of literature. Naruto nodded in understanding. To dissuade people from trying to go due to the dangers it poses. Given some of the things they saw out in the far distance just before crossing the sea, as well as the Howlbell, one of the 5 great threats, he could definitely see why the world was better off thinking it wasn't real. The thought of an unexplored world would have hunters and normal people alike all trying to make the trek and would inevitably die trying. Correct. In any case, we'll contact you as soon as we hear back. Pleasure doing business. He hung up the phone just as the bathroom door opened. Steam exited the room, and he shook his head at the absurd temperature women seemed to like to bathe with. Mei stepped out with a towel wrapped around body and one more containing her hair. She glanced at him as she made her way towards the blow-dryer. By the smile on your face I assume things with the Zoldyx went well. She asked. We're all set. They're gonna take a cut of what it sells for, but that was expected. Mei nodded and sat down in front of one of the vanity mirrors the room provided. Now that that's been settled, take a shower while I get ready. We'll have to leave soon. Naruto frowned in confusion. Had he forgotten plans they'd made? The auburn-haired woman rolled her eyes playfully and resumed drying her hair, staring at him through the reflection of the mirror. We need to buy clothes for the auction, she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. It's a formal event, and we don't have the clothes for it, so we're going shopping. She finished, her tone a bit giddy. Naruto smiled and made his way to the bathroom after getting his change of clothes. Normally, he wasn't one for long hours of shopping, but seeing how excited Mei seemed to be about it, he held his tongue and compiled. He'd gone shopping with her once back on a visit to Kiri, and it took hours. He could only imagine what he was in for here, where there seemed to be clothing stores in every direction for miles. Exhaling to himself, he turned the water on and got himself ready. Unsurprisingly, their shopping spree hadn't been a quick affair. He lost track of how many stores were visited and how much clothes they'd bought. For the auction, he'd had a tailor take his measurements in order to have a black 3-piece suit. Mei meanwhile picked up a satin blue dress that almost came down to the floor and had a large slit for the left leg to be on display. Like all women though, she proceeded to buy a pair of black high-heeled shoes and an entire wardrobe for the coming seasons. By the time they made it back to their room, the sun had long since disappeared and night had taken over. After an hour of watching TV, his woman decided she was feeling frisky, which led to them making love well into the night. The next day, so I was thinking we can head down to Day Road Park today, Naruto said after taking a bite of the food Mei had cooked up using the nitro rice. It was much tastier than they had expected, and had decided on adding a bit more of it to their meals. They were still careful how much they added, however. All they knew was that it was set to extend one's life, but they didn't want to overdo it if true. Mei raised an eyebrow, wondering what he had planned at a park. It's a nice spot from what I heard some people mention at one of the stores yesterday. After that, we can head to Bull Market, he explained. Bull Market? She asked. He nodded. It's a small-scale auction held by some of the locals from what I heard. Figure it could be a fun time, see what kind of things people are selling before the big auction. Sounds good to me, she agreed. About an hour later the pair were making their way down Yorknew's busy streets hand in hand when suddenly the blonde stopped in his tracks. What's wrong? Mei asked. She followed his line of sight and blinked in surprise. Well, he certainly isn't difficult to pick out of a crowd, Mei commented. Across the street, staring back at them with an equal amount of surprise, was none other than Hisoka. They noticed his clothing was almost the same, the only difference being the color scheme. Where it was black, white, and red at Heaven's Arena, now it was a mix of 2 different shades of green with red. The man grinned and swiftly made his way over to them. Good afternoon. Quite the surprise to see you two here this early. I was expecting you in September, he commented smoothly. Naruto smiled. You piqued my curiosity with the auction, and our time at Heaven's Arena was ending anyway, so we figured why not come check it out. The man nodded in understanding. It had happened a bit sooner than he thought, but what he wanted had come to fruition. The next part was to keep them here. Of course. The auction is the main attraction of the city at this time of the year, he commented. Also, most of my business up until the auction has been taken care of. If you'd still like to have that battle, I'm all for it, he said with glee. Naruto could feel some of the man's aura begin to leak out from him. The man was excited. He's one of those battle maniacs. I can sense underlying emotions from him. Best keep your guard up. He's definitely planning something. Kurama chimed in. Yeah, he's more experienced with Nen than us, but I have my chakra to fall back on if I really need it. This can be a good way to test my Hatsu though, so I'll take him up on his offer. Naruto mentally replied. At the same time both he and Hisoka turned to look at Mei with hopeful looks. The woman looked from one to the other, and sighed. The two of you are just like children. Fine. I assume you know a place, she asked the jester. Hisoka nodded. Of course. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity. The pair followed Hisoka as he walked through the streets. They walked for about 40 minutes until they reached an old industrial-looking area that was devoid of life. To be on the safe side, the blonde used and around the general vicinity. Not the entire 5-mile radius he was capable of, as he only needed to make sure the area was clear of any bystanders that could end up as collateral damage. I assure you no one is here, Hisoka said, standing across from him and beginning to stretch. Just making sure. Naruto shot back. So what are the rules for this? Hisoka hummed for a second before replying. I usually enjoy a good fight to the death, but for today let's just go until one of us surrenders or is incapacitated. Is that acceptable? The blonde nodded. Mei jumped away and created some distance between her and the two men. She made her way up one of the larger buildings and crossed her arms. While not as eager as Naruto, she was also curious to see what else Hisoka was capable of. He'd proven himself capable against Castro, but that man's clone was nowhere near her man's. Down below, Naruto watched as Hisoka pulled a coin out of one of his pockets and held it out in front of him. When the coin hits the ground, we begin, he announced. Just before the man could toss the coin into the air, the blonde tilted his head to the right slightly. Hisoka smirked in satisfaction when he saw the slight glow in the blonde's eyes, letting him know he'd used Chio the moment he spoke, and managed to dodge a strand of bungee gum. Tossing the coin in the air, both combatants' eyes trailed it, as it made its descent towards the floor. The moment the coin landed, Naruto began. Quicker than an average person could follow, he pulled out and fired off 10 kunai in rapid succession. The man spread his feet firmly on the ground and brought his hands up to his chest and proceeded to extend them. Naruto watched as a pink substance created a wall of sorts while also gathering at his feet. He's using his Hatsu to keep himself planted on the ground in case there's more force to the kunai, Naruto thought. The kunai collided with his nen and proceeded to try to pierce through, only to be stuck after a certain distance. Shortly after catching them, the knives were soon sent hurling back at him, forcing him to begin to dodge. As he began maneuvering through the knives, movement caught his attention. Another kunai was coming at him from his rear, then the sides. Most importantly, Hisoka was nowhere to be found. Turning around to catch one of the kunai, he noticed multiple areas around the buildings all having the pink substance along them somewhere. He set that up so that they'd come back even after dodging, and used the time I was distracted to disappear. Not bad, but not good enough. He's not to the left, right, or below, which means, jumping aside, he managed to avoid the leg drop that caused the ground to crack slightly. Hisoka looked at him with slight surprise before his grin grew, and he dashed forward. He threw a straight right followed by a left hook and a flying knee to the chin, only for the blind to easily parry the blows. Due to the battles he'd been in back home, keeping up with the man in basic hand-to-hand was simple. Seeing an opening after a straight left, he increased his speed and landed a 4-punch combination on the man's face before spin, kicking the man in the chest, causing him to slide back. To his credit, Hisoka slid only a few feet and created space between them. The man wiped a small amount of blood off the corner of his lip and with a twirl of his hand, summoned a deck of cards. The cards themselves were already glowing pink, meaning his nen was already active on them. The man threw the cards a couple at a time in different directions, forcing him to keep an eye on all of them, while never losing sight of the man himself. As he dodged he noticed the strands on the cards begin to attach to each other, forming something of a barrier around him. Nowhere to go now, Hisoka commented with a chuckle, his eyes shone with glee at the sight. Naruto watched as the man pulled out even more cards and began throwing them at even faster speeds. The cards spun so quickly he could hear them cutting through the air, letting him know the reduced speed from before was intentional. Smirking to himself at the well-thought-out plan, he extended his hand. Just as the cards were approaching, a white circular seal appeared in the air in front of him. Hisoka frowned in confusion, and his eyes widened in surprise when the cards didn't impact, but instead were absorbed. The seal began spinning in the opposite direction, and soon the cards were shot back even faster. Gathering a bit of chakra at the tip of his finger, Naruto easily cut through the strand of gum that held him in place, and disappeared. To his credit, Hisoka managed to evade the cards by jumping aside and catching a few with his Hatsu, but he wasn't prepared for the blind to appear in front of him with a display of speed he'd never encountered. Naruto's fist planted itself firmly against Hisoka's cheek, sending him flying into one of the many buildings in the area. He crashed through the wall, and presumably out of the other side if the noise was any indication. For a split second he feared he'd overdone it, but that fear was put to rest shortly after. Hisoka emerged from the light smoke that had been created with a manic grin on his face, as he rushed at him now much faster than before. Naruto ducked under a kick, and blocked 2 punches with ease. The man likewise managed to evade his counterattacks for a moment before moving his fingers slightly. "I can attach bungee gum even during your blocks," he suddenly commented. The blonde suddenly felt a strong pull, and was forced towards 2 large rocks that had the substance connected to them, as well as his palms. He attached them to the rocks in the smoke, and to my palms when I blocked his attacks. Naruto thought, now even more impressed. While Hisoka was definitely one to enjoy fighting, it didn't completely cloud his judgment. His moves were calculated, and his ingenuity was on full display. His body crashed into the rubble, but everyone knew that wouldn't be enough to put him down. He'd hardly broken a sweat so far. Similar to Hisoka, he came out of the smoke created by the impact, and dusted himself off. "Naruto." Both men looked up to see Mei standing at the edge of the building with 2 fingers pressed up against her temple. "I'm heading back to the hotel. I feel a headache coming on. I'll be there shortly," he said with some concern. The woman shook her head. "Go on ahead to Bull Market. You seemed excited to go, pick out something nice, and maybe dinner while you're at it." Naruto seemed unsure, but another look from the woman had him nod. Unknown to all of them, a little ways out from another building just outside of what Naruto's end had covered, another blonde figure was watching with interest. His eyes followed Mei as she left, and decided to follow suit. Turning back to Hisoka, he smirked. "You're definitely creative, Hisoka. That's what helped you against Castro," he complimented. "Let's see how you do here." His comment put the jester on edge instantly. His hands took on a pink hue, and his eyes sharpened. He could see the change in Naruto's demeanor, and knew another onslaught was coming. His gut was right. Naruto appeared in front of him again, and began assaulting him with punches and kicks, most of which were blocked. He could break through Hisoka's defense, but this was nothing more than a distraction. Naruto caught 2 counter punches, and kept a tight grip on the man's fists. At that moment, a second Naruto appeared next to the man, and landed a hard kick to the man's side, once again sending him tumbling. Both Narutos stood next to each other, each with the same facial expression. He'd have preferred testing his Hatsu more, but that would work better against people with projectile-style attacks. Maybe the Zoldycks would be willing to spar with him in the future, he thought to himself. Hisoka stood up once again, this time holding his ribs, wincing slightly. His eyes looked at the 2 Narutos, and he frowned in confusion. "A double?" Naruto heard him mutter to himself. He could see the gears turning in his head, wondering how he was able to do it. The Narutos smirked, and with a bit of flair, he created 4 more. "Why don't we stop here for today?" They all spoke. At once, all the clones were dispelled. It had been about a half an hour since Mei had left, and he was still worried about her. He just wanted to make sure she was alright. Hisoka dropped his stance, albeit reluctantly, and nodded. Soon, his smile was back in place, and he made his way over to the blonde. "That seems like a good idea. Your mind has been elsewhere. I'd like to try again soon with no distractions," he said, pulling his phone out. Naruto nodded. He was sure the man had held back some too for some reason, and he wanted to see what else he had up his sleeve. "I have no problems with that." "Excellent. Seeing as we'll both be here until the auction, feel free to take my contact information down. If you want to fight or need something in general, don't hesitate to ask." Naruto was a bit creeped out by the smile the man wore when saying that, but shook the feeling off. He's seen worse from Orochimaru whenever he would look at Sasuke. Besides, having someone like Hisoka on his side in the future could prove beneficial. The 2 exchanged information, and each headed off in different directions. "I'm telling you he's planning something," Kurama chimed in. "The look in his eyes when you created the clone said it all. I don't think he's planning something against you, but he definitely has you in his sights for something." Naruto mentally nodded. He wasn't sure what the man's angle was, but if it posed a threat to him or Mei, he'd take care of it. It didn't take long for him to reach Bull Market, and it was just as it had been described. A lot of people were walking through the many stands set up by common folk, all of them having their pieces on display. He wasn't sure if they knew it or not, but a quick use of Gyro told him some items had Nen embedded in them. One of them was a strange-looking pot that quickly caught his attention. Approaching the stand, he inspected the shape and design on the pot, trying to see if there was anything that would give him an idea of who had somehow left Nen embedded in it. "You can see it, can't you?" Naruto looked to his right to see the same woman in the light purple suit from the other day staring at the pot. Whoever made it must have been using Nen unconsciously while making it, she added in a soft tone. The woman turned to look at him, and with a nice smile in place, extended a hand to him. "Pakinoda. A pleasure." Naruto couldn't help, but quickly gave her a once-over. Now that he had a good look at her up close, he could say he definitely liked what he saw. Reciprocating the smile, he took her hand in his, ignoring the small spark of electricity that ran through him. Naruto Uzumaki. While Naruto continued battling it out with Izuka, Mei slowly walked away from the makeshift battlefield. Her hand came up to her temple, and gently applied pressure in a circular pattern. She felt a soothing sensation wash over her, as the pain eased up for a moment. Looking back, she saw a small bit of dust rise up in the air from the direction she had left Naruto. Thinking about the blonde put a small smile on her face, as it always did. Over the past 3 years, any time she thought of the young man who'd wormed his way into her life, a smile wouldn't be far behind, and she would be filled with a sense of adoration. Not just for him, but for herself as well. His ardent words never failed to make her feel loved. It made her feel like a young teen crushing on a boy for the first time again. That feeling only grew as the days passed, especially now. He was always protective of her even though she was quite capable of taking care of herself, but after she broke the news it had become much more apparent. There was a clear difference in his demeanor now. He didn't act like he was in his early 20s, at least not most of the time. As something caught his interest enough, he had no qualms about letting his excitement show. One such moment was when they began learning about Nen with the Zoldyck family. Learning about a completely new power system available had caught his interest, and he wanted nothing more than to become proficient at it. That excitement was what led to him being so thrilled at the prospect of fighting the jester. Naruto wasn't a battle nut by any means, but having only fought against what amounted to fodder, someone who was clearly a master of Nen use, would be the perfect person to measure his progress with the art. That wasn't to say she wasn't excited about it, she was, but perhaps the more accurate term for her was intrigue. Nen had some uses that chakra couldn't measure up to. The idea of hoarding one's own life force to extend your life, and even look younger than your age, was possibly one of her favorite things. The amount of money she would save on beauty products alone was astronomical. The principle of Hatsu also had diverse uses based on the few she had seen. It was almost as if every Nen practitioner had their own Kekkei Jinkai. While Nen definitely opened different avenues in terms of what they would be able to do, she still knew that chakra was the superior source of power. Mainly because of the lack of restrictions on the abilities one was able to perform. When it came to Nen, it was balance. The stronger the Hatsu, the greater the conditions and restrictions on it. Zeno's words echoed through her mind. With chakra, that wasn't an issue. As long as you had the necessary levels of chakra and could perform the hand signs necessary, you were good to go. Naruto knew this of course, but now that he had something new at his disposal, and after seeing how his Nen responded to the thoughts of his family, an unborn child, she could understand why he was so into it. In a way it connected him to part of his family that he'd been robbed of growing up. That was why she never burst his bubble about trying to master Nen. Plus, she couldn't deny it was a cute sight to see him excited about progressing in his training. Similar to him, she felt a sort of pride in herself after developing her own Hatsu. Had they still been in conflict back home, it would have definitely come in handy. Plus, she hypothesized that due to having chakra their Hatsu was more potent than it would have been had they been natives to this land. The ground shook slightly, followed by the sound of a small explosion. No doubt someone had been blasted into one of the buildings. Mei shook her head. I wonder how he's doing, she thought to herself. Would Hisoka make him resort to using his chakra? It was a possibility. The man wasn't one of those weaklings from Heaven's Arena, he was different. From what they had seen from his battle against Castro, he was crafty, and was clearly a master of his Hatsu. Knowing that Naruto wanted to use his Nen only, there was a strong chance he might use his chakra. If he did that though, the battle was as good as over. Tucking a strand of hair behind her left ear, she continued walking, slowing her pace down just a tad bit. Her low-heeled shoes clacked softly against the concrete with every step she took. Walking a few feet further, she glanced to the side without moving her head. She could feel someone watching her from the surrounding area. She wasn't a sensor like Ao, so she could only do so much, at least back then. The moment her right foot touched the concrete, she expelled her aura around the surrounding area using Ren. Following it up with Ten, she shaped the aura into a translucent blue dome that easily encompassed most of the area surrounding her. The entire sequence had happened in less time than it would have taken someone to blink. My Nen isn't as large as Naruto's, but it's still larger than most, according to Silva, she thought to herself. From one of the buildings behind her, she could see someone hitting. It was a man, almost 6 feet tall, and weighing about 160 pounds. He was crouching near one of the windows on the top floor of the rusty-looking building behind her. He had moved his head away just as her Nen had activated, and no doubt knew he had been found out. Why he wasn't coming out though was a mystery to her. Now knowing what she was dealing with, she once again added a mental point in Nen's favor. Sure, some shinobi were sensors, but most of them could only detect chakra, and how many people there were at a time, unless you were an outlier like Karen. And on the other hand painted a much clearer picture. Mei stopped in her tracks, but continued looking forward. How long were you planning on hiding in there? She spoke in a rather low tone, but it was still enough to resonate through the area. She cancelled her N, and turned to look in the direction she knew he was hiding. There was no movement for a moment, but she didn't look away, she could still feel his presence. As she was about to take a step forward, there was finally movement, and a blond man appeared from the windowsill. Just as her end had revealed to her, he was just as tall as she thought. He seemed like some sort of martial arts fighter, dressed in a light purple two-piece outfit consisting of pants that ended above the ankles, and a sleeveless top with teal accents with black flat-styled shoes. The man couldn't be older than 25. May raised an eyebrow in confusion as he hopped down, landing softly on his feet a few yards in front of her. The blonde wore an innocent-looking smile, and even waved at her cheerfully, as if he hadn't been spying on her. He didn't seem threatening, but through her nen she could tell that he had above-average levels of strength. He didn't seem dangerous in the same sense that Hisoka did, but he was definitely above anyone in Heaven's Arena. "Hey." He greeted me. "Can I help you with something?" May replied, not bothering to greet back. Placing a hand on her right cheek, she shot the man with a cold smile. "My husband wouldn't take kindly to knowing I was being stalked by a stranger, you know." Only after she had uttered the words did the auburn-haired woman realize what she had called him, but she found she quite liked the idea. The thought of her and Naruto in a large venue back home instantly manifested in her mind. Her in a flowing white dress, and him in one of those suits she loved seeing him in, their lips getting closer together with the whole of the world watching the union. "I apologize. I wasn't expecting your end to extend out so quickly." The image in her mind shattered as his voice reached her ears. May narrowed her eyes and crossed her arms in front of her chest. "You still haven't answered my question. Nor have you told me who you are." The blonde scratched the back of his head and laughed lightheartedly. "You're right, sorry about that. The truth is I wasn't expecting to be found out. My name is Shelnark, and I'd like to extend an invitation to." "No?" May said, cutting him off. "Whatever it is you're offering, we'll pass. We have no interest." Not wanting to hear any more, the woman turned around and resumed walking away, but she could feel that he was still standing in place, staring at her. He sighed. "I'm sorry, but I can't really accept that." Hearing the shift in his tone of voice, May stopped once again, and turned around with a visible frown on her face. Seriously, she already had a headache, and was sure she would be puking within the next 2 hours. The last thing she needed was someone bothering her. Flaring her aura, she inwardly smirked seeing the shocked look on his face, as he took a step back. In response, his own aura surrounded his body, ready to defend himself. "Last chance to turn around and leave," she threatened. As she arranged her aura back using 10, an idea came to her. "He can't know my affinity without seeing my Hatsu," she thought. "If I enhance my body using chakra, he'll have to assume I'm an enhancer, and report the wrong information to whoever he works for." At that moment, unknown to her, Shelnark realized exactly why the boss had assigned him to scope them out. He'd been told what Pakinoda was doing, but he didn't understand why the boss was willing to add more spiders instead of the standard 13. Now it all made sense. Pakinoda was definitely onto something. Seeing that the man wasn't moving, May took the initiative. Shelnark's eyes were still looking ahead even as the woman's foot was centimeters from his face. The kick connected, and the blonde was violently shot away into the building where he had been hiding. Tilting her head to the side, she allowed a small black antenna to harmlessly pass by her. The dark shadow formed from within the smoke he created, and soon he was on the attack. Her hands were up, and quickly moving in order to parry the blows he sent her way. Her eyes didn't miss the second antenna that was hidden in his left hand. The small needle was just barely peeking out of his fist, letting her know that had to be a condition for his ability to work. An antenna means he has some sort of controlling ability. A manipulator to be sure. She thought to herself, ducking under a punch. Retaliating with a few punches of her own, she confirmed her suspicions when his left hand turned in an unorthodox way, no doubt trying to connect with her skin. His smile had faded, replaced with a look of intense concentration. Smirking to herself, she caught his left hand, and faster than he could react, extended her left leg straight up to connect with his chin. His body would have been airborne had she not kept her grip on his hand. Bringing her leg back down quickly, she made sure to coat it with chakra, and directed a kick straight into his chest. Despite being disoriented by the attack, Shelnark had the sense to use his free arm, in a feeble attempt to cushion the blow. He succeeded, albeit barely. The quick use of Gyro showed her that he had coated his arm and upper body with his aura, in an attempt to not have both his arm and chest completely destroyed. Just as before, Shelnark was sent barreling back into the building, this time destroying a large part of the first floor. May could feel him still on the ground in the darkness, holding on to his damaged arm. He was lucky she had only used a little bit of chakra. If she had wanted to, his arm and chest would have shattered. Is he finished? She wondered to herself. He was getting up, that much she was sure of, but would he be stupid enough to actually again? His ability relied on tagging a target with the antenna, but he should know by this point that wouldn't be a possibility with her. A dark shape began to form in the debris once more, only this time Shelnark stepped out calmly, showing no indication that he would try to attack again. Her eyes glanced at his arm, which was now a dark purple, and bits of the top he wore were ripped at multiple places. Strangely enough, the smile was back in place. Well, I suppose I'll just have to try again some other time, he said happily. Can I get your name though? Staring at him with her visible green eye, she stayed silent for a moment before answering. May. May? Nice name. Well, May, I hope you and husband change your mind soon. I'll see you again some other time, he said before turning around and dashing away. She contemplated chasing him down, but the headache was starting to return and she wanted nothing more than to lay down. Besides, it wasn't as if he could do much with just her name. They weren't from here, they didn't have any records, her name was useless to him. Gazing in the direction Shelnark went, she was half tempted to use N again to make sure he had really left. After a second thought she shook her head and put her fingers up to her temple again to soothe herself. It wasn't worth the effort. Picking up the pace, she made her way back to the hotel, hopefully this time without any unwanted visitors. Are you looking for anything in particular? Naruto asked curiously as they walked through the many different displays. Most of the vendors had low-end goods for sale, some sold phones in the shape of beetles, which was odd. Part of him was tempted to get one just to see the look on May's face when he showed it, but changed his mind at the last second. Pakinota shrugged. Not really. I just happened to be in the area and thought I'd like to see what they had, she replied softly. I'm not really expecting to find anything incredible, but you never know. He agreed with that sentiment. I'm on the same page. I heard about this little auction and thought maybe I'd find something interesting. Have you been here long? Just arrived actually. I hope you don't mind me tagging along with you while you're here. I think things like this are more enjoyable with someone as opposed to alone. Naruto nodded. Yeah, it's no problem. There's no reason why we can't enjoy ourselves, he replied happily. I'd like to see if there's any other items embedded with Nen, he added afterward. She looked at him out of the corner of her eye and focused on his aura. The feeling washed over her in an instant. Now that she was right next to him, she could tell just how much power he possessed. The thought of using psychometry crossed her mind, but she discarded it almost immediately. The ability relied on touch, and the moment she did so, she was sure he would be aware of it. The last thing she needed was for him to begin questioning her motives. Pakinota knew that if a fight were to break out, she would be dead before she even realized he moved. Those objects are usually rare to find, she informed him, following Naruto to the nearest booth he'd selected. It'll either be something like a knife or a completely obscure object. Naruto hummed at her words. Like a Ben's knife? He asked. She blinked and nodded. Exactly like a Ben's knife. She glanced down at the table and saw a jagged-looking blade on display. Are you familiar with these? The blonde shook his head as he picked up the knife, admiring the strange shape. No. The older woman went on to explain to him the history of Benny Dillon and how he created a new knife for every victim he claimed during his time. He must have been using Nen subconsciously, and each knife now has a bit of his aura. While he didn't particularly like this Benny character, he couldn't help but be enthralled by the blonde woman's words. That was the beauty of being in a new land. Any little thing could have a deep history behind it, and these knives just so happened to be tied to a serial killer. Staring at the blade a bit longer, he called the stand owner and made a bid, to the slight surprise of his new friend. You buying it? She asked. You don't seem the type. Naruto glanced at her and let a playful smile grace his face. Really? He asked, letting the owner wrap the blade up for him. What type do I seem like? She wasn't sure how long passed, but she found herself unable to answer as his blue eyes bore into her own. Eventually though, she was able to get a hold of herself and respond. Not breaking eye contact, she spoke in the same soft tone. The type to handle something up close without the need for weapons. The way you carry yourself tells me you're confident in your abilities. To the point where I don't believe you would have any need for a Ben's knife, she analyzed. Naruto stared back with slightly raised eyebrows at her deduction. She was mostly spot on. The knife was nothing more than a souvenir due to liking the shape and knowing it had some history behind it. While she didn't say it outright, he remembered what Ging had told him when they met while they were training. People could still feel their power even while using Zetsu. There was no doubt in his mind Pakinota could sense the power he held and use that to make her deduction. Chuckling softly, he walked past her. You're right on most points. I don't really need it, but I like it. Oh, look at that, he said excitedly, pointing to another booth. The woman rolled her eyes lightly, but felt no real annoyance. If anything, this was a breath of fresh air. Her usual interaction came from the members of the troupe, namely Machi, and occasionally Shelnark. While she may genuinely like people like them, their usual interactions always had something to do with a job or a target they were trying to kill. Walking alongside the younger blonde, she felt like she was simply enjoying time with a friend. It had been so long since she'd last done so, she didn't even remember what it felt like. Walking around, chatting, and listening to his attempts to make her laugh while not needing to worry about completing a job. That thought brought her to a pause. She was on a recruitment job. Staring at his back, as he leaned over a table to inspect another item, she wondered how to proceed. Her plan was to get close to both him and the woman that was with him, but she was nowhere to be found. The option to try to seduce him was on the table, but that could easily backfire, as well. She knew nothing about the woman, except that she was certainly more powerful than her. If she made a move, and it wasn't reciprocated, then word would get back to her, and all hope of succeeding would disappear. She smiled politely, as Naruto turned around to show her another item he was planning on buying. In the end she decided to continue, as she was for today, it would help to get closer. The two continued making their way from booth to booth, looking over the mostly useless items up for sale. On occasion, something would catch their attention that she would most likely have to fill him in on. It was unusual, in her opinion, that he didn't seem to know some things that would be common knowledge. He was knowledgeable about Nen, which meant he could be a licensed hunter, but that didn't explain his lack of knowledge on certain subjects. All of these observations went into the mental file she created for him in her mind. You know, I don't think I asked this yet. Naruto began. What brings you to Yorknu? Is it the auction? He asked. That was still a ways off, and from what he gathered, most of the big names wouldn't appear until the day before the day of work. She replied simply. She's not lying, but she's definitely not telling the whole truth. Kurama chimed in from within his mind. Naruto glanced at her out of the corner of his eye, and stuffed his hands in his pockets, letting the small bags he had rest on his wrists. You don't sound too thrilled about it, he noted. Hakinoda exhaled silently, but enough so that Naruto could see her chest deflate slightly. She hesitated for a moment, and turned to look at him before turning her attention back in front of him. Truth be told, I don't really like my job, she revealed, but without it she trailed off. He noted that while her face remained as stoic as it had through most of their time together, he could still sense a sort of emptiness within her. It reminded him of when he was a kid, and put on a fake front for people only to return to an empty home. Have you ever considered just taking a chance, and quitting? He questioned. The woman looked up at the sky briefly, and took a breath. I have, but those thoughts always led to the same conclusion. Naruto waited for her to elaborate, but after passing a few stalls without a word, he realized he wouldn't be getting any more than that. Sensing that the mood had shifted, he quickly scanned the area until his eyes landed on just the thing that would help them out at the moment. Leading her over to a booth, he told her to wait for a moment, and left. She looked slightly confused by the request, but complied, and looked at the trinkets available for sale. Naruto returned 2 minutes later, holding 2 small pastries served on a small paper dish. Holding one out, he was delighted to see her grin slightly, and accept the food. Reaching out, her fingers glided over his softly, as she took the plate. Thank you. Naruto took a bite, and made a note to go back, and get another for Mei after he bought their dinner. Feeling better? He asked kindly. I am. You didn't need to buy me anything, but it's appreciated. She replied. It was nothing. I'm not sure what you do, or what you don't like about it, but I think if you're unhappy or bored with how your life is, do what you think would be best for you. He advised. That's what he had done. He wasn't sure whether there was life beyond what he knew, but he took a chance, and he was here now happier than he'd ever been. I know we just met, but I can tell there's more to you than what you've shown. Similar to how he'd done earlier, she mirrored his playful smile, although hers didn't quite reach her eyes. Really? What do you see when you look at me? Making sure to look her in the eyes, he responded after a second to get his thoughts in order. I see someone who hides behind a false persona. You stay in a situation that you no longer want, but see no way out, which has made you aloof. In the time we've been together though, I've seen that you have no problem laughing openly, making small jokes, and actually having a good time. Those little things are what tell me there's more to you than you show. You just don't know who to show it to. He didn't even need to use Kurama to know that much. As he spoke, the look on her face changed from mirroring his earlier look to one of slight surprise at his deduction. So? How'd I do? Hakinoda broke their eye contact, and took a bite of the pastry, then turned her attention forward once more. I'd say you were pretty spot on. She replied softly. Well, now you don't have to worry about that last point at least. I know I can't force you to quit your job, but if you need a friend, I'd be more than happy to lend an ear whenever you need it. Naruto wasn't aware, but his words had an effect on the older woman. She managed to keep herself together on the outside, but couldn't deny the feeling welling within her. It had been a long time since she last felt a bit of genuine happiness, but it was there. The woman felt her phone vibrate from the pocket in her skirt, and discreetly pulled it out to check the time. Well, as much fun as this has been, I should be going, she said, stopping at the end of Bull Market next to the first stall. She spoke again. I hope this doesn't sound too forward, but would you mind exchanging contact information? Pulling his own phone out, he shook his head. Not at all. He had become well versed with his phone, and could now save contacts directly, something he was pretty proud of. Once her number was in his phone, and his in hers, she thanked him for a good time, and promised to call him soon before heading out. Once she disappeared into the city, he checked his phone as well, and decided to leave the market too. He still needed to get ingredients for dinner tonight, and stopped by again to get a pastry for Mei. You're here already? Hakinoda's attention diverted to the small alleyway in between 2 large buildings to see one of her colleagues stepping out. She noted the few scuffs on his face, and clothing along with the pleased look on his face. It was a look he only wore when something amused him or he found someone worth fighting. I should be asking you that. she replied, continuing her walk, not at all bothered that the man began to match her pace and walk alongside her. You only ever show up when you believe it's convenient. Yet here you are a month and a half early. It makes me wonder what you're thinking. Izuka gave a nonchalant shrug. I have business with a friend here, he replied. In fact, you were just with him a few minutes ago. Takinoda narrowed her eyes at the gesture, suspicion clear in them. You're friends with Naruto? She found it hard to believe. Izuka wasn't the type to have any real friends from what she knew of him. The man saw people as prayer toys, nothing in between. The red-haired man nodded in satisfaction and brought a hand up to his chest in a dramatic fashion. Yes. Him and Mei both actually. What I'm interested to know is how are you friends with him? Izuka's mind began working overtime, and it didn't take long to realize that Chrollo had already learned of them and found it necessary to look into them. To do so, he sent Takinoda to investigate whether they would be a threat, and if so, what to do about them. A sinister grin appeared on his face at the thought. Just off their brief spar, he had only scratched the surface of what Naruto could do, and he knew one thing. No one in the troop stood a chance against him, but that just made it all the more exciting to him. Both Naruto and Mei were out of his league for the time being, but maybe he could use them to put himself in a position to fight Chrollo. I bumped into him at Bull Market, and once before that. We hit it off well, she replied calmly. Inside though she was anything but calm. Izuka was always an off-putting individual, but knowing he was close to the people she needed to win over only made her feel uneasy. No one knew what he was thinking or why he did what he did. With a simple whim he could ruin her objective. Have you ever considered just taking a chance and quitting? Naruto's words came back to her. If she did that she wouldn't need to worry about anything Izuka did. They're an interesting pair, that's for sure, Izuka said. Naruto has been the only person who's ever come to me asking for a fight. I get a feeling we'll be best friends in no time. Anyway, it was nice seeing you, but I have other things to take care of. Giving her one final friendly smile, he turned at the end of the street and walked off. Having his back to her, the woman never noticed the change in his facial expression. The kind smile was replaced with a malicious smirk. His tongue licked his bottom lip from left to right in anticipation. He didn't know what Takinoda was doing, but perhaps they'd be able to come to an understanding soon. The end. Thanks for watching my video. Leave a like if you enjoyed my video, and also do consider subscribing to my channel for more awesome content. And make sure to check out the author of this fanfic. Link is in the description. See you next time. Till then, sayonara.